If there is one thing I learned after my father died, it is that the dead can leave behind more than photographs, furniture, and unfinished business. Sometimes they leave questions. Sometimes they leave secrets. And sometimes they leave behind an entire part of their lives that they deliberately kept hidden from the people who loved them most. My father's greatest secret was waiting inside the house where I had spent my childhood, behind a wall I had walked past thousands of times without ever realizing there was something on the other side. Before I tell you how I found it, I want you to think about something. If you discovered that one of your parents had hidden an entire room from you for 30 years, would you immediately open the door? Or would you be afraid of what you might find? My name is Clara Bennett, and for most of my life, I believed I understood my family. I grew up in a quiet neighborhood where everyone knew everyone, and our house sat at the end of a tree-lined street that seemed almost unchanged by time. For decades, I carried a strange mixture of sadness and resentment toward a woman I barely remembered. I wondered what kind of mother could leave her 6-year-old daughter behind. Whenever people asked about my mother, I learned to keep my answer simple. I would say that she had left when I was young and that we had never been reunited. Eventually, the story became so familiar that I stopped questioning it myself. My father had raised me alone, worked hard, and made sure I had everything I needed. In my mind, whatever happened between him and my mother belonged to the past. Then my father died. He passed away peacefully at 78 after several months of declining health. I was with him during his final week, and although he couldn't speak much toward the end, there were moments when he seemed to be trying to tell me something. One evening, he asked whether I had ever wondered about my mother. I assumed the medication was affecting him because he hadn't brought her up in years. I told him that I had made peace with the past. He looked at me for several seconds, then turned his face toward the window. At the time, I didn't understand why that question seemed so important to him. After the funeral, I returned to the house to begin sorting through his belongings. I had decided to keep the property because selling it immediately felt wrong. Every room contained memories of my childhood, and I wasn't ready to turn those memories into a real estate listing. I spent the first few days going through drawers, closets, and cabinets, separating things I wanted to keep from things that could be donated. I found old birthday cards, school reports, photographs, Christmas decorations, and boxes of my childhood drawings that my father had carefully preserved. On the fourth afternoon, I decided to clean the upstairs hallway. There wasn't anything particularly interesting about that part of the house. It was simply a narrow corridor connecting the bedrooms to the staircase. One wall contained several framed photographs, while the opposite side held a small wooden cabinet my father had built himself. As I moved the cabinet to clean behind it, I noticed something I had never paid attention to before. The wall behind it looked different. At first, I thought it was simply an old repair. The paint was slightly different in color, and there was a faint vertical line running from the floor to nearly the ceiling. I ran my fingers over it and felt a narrow indentation. I stepped back and looked at the wall from several angles. The shape was unmistakable. There was a door behind the wall. I stood there for several minutes, trying to convince myself that I was imagining it. I knew the layout of the house. I had grown up there. There shouldn't have been another room behind that section of hallway. The bedroom on the other side was my father's old study, and according to the floor plan I remembered, the space behind the wall should have been part of that room. But the measurements didn't make sense. I fetched a tape measure and began comparing the hallway dimensions with the dimensions of the study. There was approximately 8 feet of unexplained space between them. 8 feet that didn't appear anywhere on the original floor plan. 8 feet that had apparently been hidden from me for my entire life. My first thought was that perhaps my father had created a storage space decades earlier and simply forgotten to mention it. That explanation seemed reasonable until I noticed something else. There was a small keyhole hidden beneath several layers of paint. I searched my father's workshop for a key. I found dozens. None fit. For the next 2 hours, I searched every drawer, toolbox, cabinet, and old container in the house. Eventually, I found a small brass key inside a wooden box containing my father's personal documents. The key had a faded paper tag attached to it, but the writing was so old that I could barely read it. I held it beneath the light and recognized 2 words: for Clara. My hands began to tremble. I carried the key upstairs and stood in front of the hidden door. I didn't put it into the lock immediately. Instead, I remembered my father's final conversation with me. I remembered him asking whether I had ever wondered about my mother. I remembered the way he had looked toward the window instead of answering when I said I had made peace with the past. Suddenly, I wondered whether those 2 things were connected. I inserted the key. It turned. The lock clicked softly, and the hidden door opened inward. Behind it was a small room covered in dust. There was an old wooden desk against one wall, several filing cabinets, a narrow bookshelf, and a single chair facing a large covered window. Nothing about the room looked frightening. It looked abandoned, forgotten, preserved. Then I noticed the photographs. They covered the desk. Photographs of my mother. Not 1 or 2. Dozens. Some showed her before I was born. Others showed her holding me as a baby. There were photographs of us together when I was 3, 4, and 5 years old. There were pictures of birthdays I barely remembered, and places I had never known revisited. My father had told me my mother wanted nothing to do with us, yet he had kept dozens of photographs of her hidden in a locked room. I picked up the nearest photograph and turned it over. There was a date written on the back. Then I saw the handwriting. It wasn't my father's. It was my mother's. The message on the back contained only 1 sentence. Thomas, if Clara ever finds this room, she deserves to know why I left. I stared at those words until they blurred. My mother hadn't simply disappeared. She had left something behind. And my father had spent 30 years making sure I never found it. I spent almost an hour standing inside that hidden room without touching anything else. The photograph in my hand felt heavier than it should have, as though the few words written on the back had somehow changed the entire history of my childhood. My father had always told me that my mother left because she no longer wanted to be part of our family. Yet here I was, surrounded by photographs proving that she had remained emotionally connected to me. There were pictures of birthdays, holidays, school events, and ordinary afternoons that I didn't even remember. If my mother had truly wanted nothing to do with me, why had she taken the time to document my childhood? I carefully placed the photograph back on the desk and began examining everything else in the room. The desk drawers contained stacks of letters tied together with faded blue ribbon. Some were addressed to my father, while others had my name written on the envelopes. None of them had ever been delivered. I opened the first envelope addressed to me and found a letter dated 31 years earlier, written when I was only 7 years old. My mother had written about how much she missed me and how she hoped that one day I would understand why she had been forced to leave. She didn't explain what had forced her to go, but she repeatedly apologized for being absent. I read several more letters, and the pattern became impossible to ignore. My mother had written to me regularly for years. There were letters from when I was 7, 8, 9, 10, and even 12 years old. The later letters were longer and more emotional. suggesting that she had continued trying to find a way back into my life. One letter described a birthday present she had purchased for me, but never managed to send. Another mentioned that she had seen a photograph of me in a local newspaper and was proud of the young woman I was becoming. I sat down on the dusty chair and began crying because the story I had believed for most of my life was collapsing in front of me.
I had always imagined my mother walking away without looking back. I had pictured her leaving our house, getting into a car, and choosing a different life without me. Now, I realized that image had been created almost entirely by my father's words. I had never heard my mother's side. I had never seen these letters. I had never known she had tried to contact me. Someone had deliberately kept those attempts hidden. The next discovery was even more disturbing. Inside the bottom drawer of the desk, I found a small cassette recorder and several labeled tapes. The labels contained dates, and one of them was dated only a few weeks before my mother disappeared. I didn't have a cassette player in the house anymore, but my father had kept an old audio system in the basement. I carried the recorder downstairs, found the system, and spent several frustrating minutes trying to make the equipment work. Eventually, the speakers crackled, and the first recording began. My mother's voice filled the room. I froze. I hadn't heard that voice since I was 6 years old. I didn't remember much about it, but hearing it again created an emotion I couldn't explain. She sounded nervous in the recording, but she was speaking calmly. She explained that she had discovered something involving my father and another person. She said she had become frightened after realizing that someone was watching her movements. She didn't provide enough details for me to understand what she meant, but she repeatedly mentioned that she didn't want anything to happen to me. Then, she said something that made me stop the recording. She said my father had promised to protect me. I replayed that section several times. My father had never told me my mother was afraid. He had never said anything about someone watching her. He had never told me that she believed she was in danger. Instead, he had spent 30 years telling me she simply wanted to leave. I returned to the hidden room and searched through the filing cabinets. The first cabinet contained old financial records and property documents. The second contained medical records and insurance papers. The third was locked, but I found the key taped beneath the desk. Inside were documents that had nothing to do with ordinary family matters. There were copies of police reports, photographs of unfamiliar men, handwritten notes, and newspaper clippings about a local company that had gone bankrupt shortly before my mother's disappearance. The company was called Bennett Industrial Supply. My father's name appeared on several documents connected to it. I knew my father had owned a small contracting business, but I had never heard of Bennett Industrial Supply. According to the documents, the company had been involved in a financial dispute with several investors. There had been accusations of fraud, missing money, and falsified records. The company eventually collapsed, and several people involved had faced lawsuits. My father's name appeared in the records, but the documents suggested he had been a witness rather than the person accused of wrongdoing. Then, I found my mother's name. She had been listed as a potential witness. I sat down again. Suddenly, her disappearance didn't look like a family problem anymore. It looked connected to something much larger. One document contained a handwritten note from my father. He had written that Margaret had become convinced someone involved with the company was following her. He had apparently tried to reassure her, but she had insisted that she had discovered evidence that could expose several people. Another note suggested that she had planned to meet someone shortly before she disappeared. I searched for the person's name. It was missing. The name had been cut out of the document. Someone had physically removed it. I began searching through every file with increasing urgency. I found more references to my mother, but
every time the documents approached the most important part of the story, something was missing. A page had been removed. A name had been blacked out. A photograph had been torn. It was as if someone had spent years carefully editing the evidence. Then I found a small envelope hidden behind the filing cabinet. It contained a photograph of my mother standing beside another woman. I recognized the woman immediately. She was Eleanor Price, my father's closest friend and business partner. Eleanor had been part of my life for as long as I could remember. She had attended my childhood birthday parties, helped my father after my mother disappeared, and remained close to our family for decades. She had always spoken kindly about my mother, although she usually avoided discussing the circumstances surrounding her disappearance. On the back of the photograph was a date. It was taken 2 days before my mother disappeared. There was another message written beneath it. Eleanor knows what happened. I felt the room closing in around me. For 30 years, Eleanor had been telling me that my mother had chosen to leave. Now I was holding evidence suggesting that Eleanor knew more than she had ever admitted. I immediately called her. She answered with the same warm voice I had known since childhood, asking how I was coping after my father's death. I almost told her everything. I almost asked her whether she knew about the hidden room, the letters, and the photograph. But something stopped me. For the first time in my life, I decided not to tell someone what I had discovered. I told Eleanor that I was cleaning the house and asked whether she remembered anything unusual about the week my mother disappeared. There was a long pause before she answered. She said she remembered very little and believed it had been too long ago to recall specific details. Her response sounded ordinary, but I noticed something in her voice. She was nervous. I thanked her and ended the call. Then I went back into the hidden room and looked at the photograph again. My mother was smiling. Eleanor was smiling too. But behind them, partially visible through a window, was a car parked across the street. I recognized that car. It belonged to my father. And suddenly, I realized something terrifying. My father hadn't simply known that my mother was planning to leave. He had been there when she disappeared. The question was no longer, why did my mother leave? The question was, what happened between my mother, my father, and Eleanor that night? I didn't sleep after discovering that photograph. I kept thinking about the car outside the building and the message written on the back of the picture. My father had always claimed that he had been at home that night, waiting for my mother to return. Yet the photograph placed him at the exact location where my mother had apparently met Eleanor 2 days before she disappeared. There were too many coincidences now. The hidden room, the letters, the recording, the business documents, and the photograph all pointed toward a story my father had deliberately kept from me. I knew I couldn't confront Eleanor without knowing more, so I spent the entire night going through every document I could find. By morning, I had constructed a timeline of the weeks leading up to my mother's disappearance. The financial problems at Bennett Industrial Supply had begun months earlier. My mother had apparently discovered irregular transactions involving several accounts connected to the company. She had also become convinced that someone was using the business to move money without the knowledge of some of the owners. My father had initially tried to dismiss her concerns, but eventually his own notes suggested that he had begun investigating. The more I studied the records, the clearer it became that my parents had been dealing with something dangerous long before I was old enough to understand it. I found a second cassette recording that explained even more. My mother's voice sounded frightened this time, and she spoke about a meeting she had attended with Eleanor. She said Eleanor had admitted that she knew about the missing money, but insisted that she wasn't responsible for it. My mother apparently didn't believe her. She had written down several names and planned to take the information to the authorities. Then she mentioned something that made me pause the recording again. She said she had discovered that someone had been using my father's name to authorize financial transfers. I couldn't understand why anyone would do that. Then I remembered something my father had told me years earlier. He had said that my mother became increasingly suspicious and emotional before she left. He had described her as paranoid and overwhelmed, almost as though she had lost the ability to distinguish between real danger and imagined threats. At the time, I had believed him because I had no reason to question his account. Now, I wondered whether he had deliberately made her sound unstable so that nobody would take her accusations seriously. I decided to visit Eleanor. She lived about 20 minutes away in the same house where she had raised her children. When she opened the door, I could immediately tell she hadn't expected me. She smiled and invited me inside, but her expression changed when I mentioned my mother's name. I didn't show her the photograph. Instead, I told her that I had found some old family documents and wanted to understand what had happened before my mother disappeared. Eleanor became unusually quiet, and for the first time since I had known her, I saw genuine fear in her eyes. She tried to tell me that my mother had been under tremendous stress and that the problems at the company had affected her judgment. But I told her I had found the letters. I told her I had heard the recordings. I told her that my mother had written about being afraid and had mentioned people watching her. Eleanor looked toward the window and took a long breath. Then she admitted that my mother had never intended to abandon me. Hearing those words from Eleanor felt like being struck. For 30 years, I had blamed my mother for leaving me. Eleanor had known that the story was false. She had watched me grow up believing that my mother had chosen to disappear. She had attended my birthdays and listened to me talk about missing her while knowing that my mother had been trying to contact me. I asked her why she had allowed me to believe such a terrible thing, but she struggled to answer. She finally admitted that my father had convinced her that keeping the truth hidden was the only way to protect me. I asked what he was protecting me from. That was when Eleanor finally told me the truth. My mother had discovered that someone inside Bennett Industrial Supply had been stealing money and using company accounts to hide the transactions. The person responsible had access to financial records and knew exactly how to make the transfers appear legitimate. My mother believed she had identified the person, but before she could expose them, she disappeared. Eleanor had been present during one of the final meetings my mother had before leaving town, but Eleanor insisted that she had not harmed her. She said my mother had left because she was afraid. I asked where she had gone. Eleanor told me she didn't know. Then she revealed something I never expected. My father did. According to Eleanor, my mother had arranged to leave town temporarily because she believed someone was watching her. My father had agreed to help her disappear until the danger passed. He told Eleanor that I would be safer if everyone believed Margaret had abandoned us. The plan was supposedly temporary. My mother intended to return once the threat had disappeared, but she never came back. I felt my entire understanding of my childhood collapse. My father hadn't been trying to punish my mother. He'd been trying to protect her. But that didn't explain why he had hidden her letters from me for 30 years. Eleanor eventually told me that something had gone wrong after my mother left. She had contacted my father from another state and told him she had discovered who was behind the financial scheme. She wanted to come home. My father begged her not to return because he believed the people involved were still watching the family. Then, Margaret stopped contacting him. My father told Eleanor that he assumed the worst, but he never told the police. That was the part I couldn't understand. If my father believed my mother was in danger, why hadn't he reported her disappearance as suspicious? Why had he allowed everyone to believe she had simply walked away? Why had he kept her letters locked inside a hidden room instead of showing them to me? Eleanor didn't have all the answers, but she had one more piece of information. She told me that my father had received one final letter from my mother approximately 6 months after she disappeared. The letter had been delivered by someone my father never identified. It contained only a few words, but my father had kept it hidden. Eleanor remembered what it said because my father had shown it to her. Margaret was alive. I felt my knees weaken. For 30 years, I had mourned a mother I believed had abandoned me. My father had apparently known she was alive. I returned home immediately and searched through every document in the hidden room again. This time, I wasn't looking for evidence about the company. I was looking for the final letter. I searched every drawer, every folder, and every box until I found a small envelope hidden inside an old book. The envelope contained a letter dated 30 years earlier. It was from my mother. She wrote that she was alive and that she loved me. She said she had been forced to stay away because returning home would put me in danger. She also wrote that she had trusted my father to explain everything when the danger passed. Then came the sentence that destroyed me. She wrote that she had recently discovered the identity of the person responsible for the financial scheme. She named them. And the name wasn't Eleanor. It wasn't my father. It was someone I had never suspected. Someone who had remained connected to our family for 30 years. I read the name again. Then I looked at the date on the letter. My mother had written it 6 months after she disappeared, which meant she had been alive. And if the letter was genuine, then somewhere in the world, my mother might still be alive today. But there was something else inside the envelope. A recent photograph. Not 30 years old, not 20 years old. Recent. It showed an elderly woman standing outside a small coastal house. The woman was older, her hair completely gray, but I recognized her immediately. It was my mother. And written beneath the photograph in my father's handwriting were 4 words that changed everything. She knows I lied. The name written in my mother's letter was Arthur Whitmore. I knew that name immediately because Arthur had been part of my childhood for as long as I could remember. He had been the financial director of Bennett Industrial Supply and one of my father's closest business associates. When I was young, he had attended family dinners, brought me birthday presents, and sometimes took me to the local bookstore when my father was busy working. I had always thought of him as an uncle rather than a business associate. He had remained connected to my father long after the company collapsed, and even after I became an adult, he occasionally called to check on me. The realization that my mother had identified him as the person responsible for the financial scheme made me feel physically sick. I immediately searched through the documents in the hidden room for his name. It appeared everywhere. Arthur had authorized several of the suspicious transfers. His signature appeared on financial documents that my mother had apparently questioned. There were notes indicating that he had access to accounts that other employees couldn't reach. Most disturbing of all, I found a document showing that Arthur had transferred money from one of the company's accounts shortly before the business began collapsing. The transaction had originally been explained as a legitimate investment, but the money had disappeared into another company that Arthur secretly controlled. Suddenly, everything began making sense. My mother hadn't been imagining things. She had discovered a financial scheme that involved someone powerful enough to manipulate company records and influence the people around him. Arthur had the knowledge and access to make the fraud look legitimate. He also had something else that made him extremely dangerous: trust. People believed him because my father trusted him. My father had built his business with Arthur for years, and I realized that my father's loyalty to his business partner might have prevented him from seeing what was happening until it was too late. I called Eleanor again and asked her about Arthur. This time, she didn't hesitate. She admitted that Margaret had suspected Arthur for months. She had confronted him about several missing payments and discovered that the companies receiving the money were connected to him. Arthur had denied everything and threatened to ruin Margaret's reputation if she continued investigating. Eleanor said Margaret had become frightened because she realized Arthur wasn't simply stealing money. He had begun manipulating people around him to make sure nobody would believe her if she spoke. That explained why my mother had recorded those conversations. She had known she needed evidence because she believed nobody would take her word against Arthur's. She had apparently started keeping copies of financial documents and recording conversations with people connected to the company. She wasn't paranoid. She was preparing for a fight against someone who had spent years building a respectable reputation. Then Eleanor told me something about my father that completely changed how I viewed him. Thomas had eventually discovered what Arthur was doing. He had confronted him. Arthur had threatened him. My father had apparently been terrified that if he exposed Arthur immediately, Arthur would retaliate against me. At the time, I had been only 6 years old. My father believed that keeping me away from the situation was the safest thing he could do. He arranged for Margaret to leave temporarily while he tried to gather enough evidence to expose Arthur. That was why my mother had disappeared so suddenly. But the plan had failed. Margaret had gone into hiding while my father remained behind to protect me. Arthur had continued operating in the background. And then Margaret discovered something that made her realize she couldn't safely return. She had found evidence that Arthur had been paying someone inside the local police department to warn him whenever investigators became interested in the company's finances. That meant Margaret couldn't simply walk into a police station and expect protection. She had no idea who she could trust. My father had therefore made the terrible decision to let everyone believe she had abandoned us. It was a decision that protected me physically, but destroyed my understanding of my mother for 30 years. I couldn't decide whether to be angry with him or grateful to him. Perhaps I was both. The photograph of my mother changed everything again. It had been taken only months earlier. She was alive. She was living near the coast under another name, and my father had apparently known where she was. I found additional notes in the hidden room that explained how they had remained in occasional contact. My father had visited her several times over the years, but had never told me because Margaret was still afraid Arthur would discover where she lived. Then I found the final piece. My father's handwriting explained that Arthur had never stopped looking for Margaret. He had continued asking questions about her. He'd even contacted my father years later, pretending to be concerned about whether Margaret might return. My father had realized that Arthur was still afraid of what she knew. That meant Arthur had spent 30 years believing the truth might eventually come out. And he had remained close to me. I suddenly remembered something that had happened only 6 months before my father died. Arthur had visited the house and spent almost an hour talking with my father privately. At the time, I had assumed they were discussing old business matters. Now I wondered whether Arthur had been checking whether my father had finally decided to reveal the truth. I also remembered something else. After my father died, Arthur had been one of the first people to call me. He had offered to help me sort through my father's documents. He had asked whether I had discovered anything unusual. At the time, I had thought he was simply being kind. Now I understood why he had been asking. He wanted to know whether I had found the hidden room. He wanted to know whether my father had left evidence behind. And he had almost succeeded in finding out. I contacted my mother's attorney, whose information I found among the documents. And after several days of verification, I finally received the address of the coastal house. I drove there alone, although I kept Detective Harris informed about where I was going. The journey felt surreal. For 30 years, I had imagined my mother as a distant memory. Now I was driving toward a place where she was supposedly still alive. When I finally arrived, I sat in the car for several minutes before getting out. The house was small and peaceful. There were flowers near the front steps and a wooden bench overlooking the ocean. Then the front door opened,
an elderly woman stepped outside. Her hair was gray, her face thinner, and her posture more fragile than I remembered. But there was no mistaking her. It was my mother. For several seconds, neither of us moved. Then she covered her mouth with her hand. I didn't need her to say my name. She knew exactly who I was. I walked toward her, and the moment we finally embraced, 30 years of anger, confusion, grief, and unanswered questions came rushing out at once. I cried like the 6-year-old girl who had spent her entire childhood wondering why her mother didn't love her enough to stay. My mother held me tightly and kept apologizing, telling me that she had never stopped loving me and that leaving me had been the hardest decision of her life. Inside the house, she finally told me everything. Arthur had stolen millions from the company. When Margaret discovered the fraud, he tried to intimidate her into silence. When that failed, he manipulated the company records to make it appear that Thomas was responsible for several of the missing transactions. My father realized what was happening and tried to protect Margaret and me. But Arthur discovered that Margaret had evidence. That was when he began hunting for her. My mother had spent 30 years believing that returning home could put me in danger. She had watched my life from a distance whenever she could. She had seen photographs of my graduation. She knew when I married. She knew when I had my daughter. She had never stopped being my mother. She had simply been living with the terrible belief that loving me meant staying away from me. But there was one final truth my mother had kept from me.
Arthur was still alive, and he was still in Cedar Creek. Worse, he was still respected. He had spent 30 years rebuilding his reputation after Bennett Industrial Supply collapsed. He had become a successful financial consultant and donated money to local charities. People praised him as a generous businessman who had overcome the difficulties of his past. Nobody knew what he had done, except my mother. And now, me.
My mother reached into a drawer and removed a small folder. Inside were copies of the original financial records, photographs, recordings, and documents she had preserved for 30 years. She looked at me with tears in her eyes and explained that she had waited all these years because she was afraid exposing Arthur would put me in danger. But she also admitted something else. She was tired of being afraid. I looked at the evidence spread across the table. For 30 years, my family had been shaped by a lie. My father had hidden the truth to protect me. My mother had stayed away to protect me. Eleanor had remained silent because she was afraid. And Arthur had built an entire life on the assumption that nobody would ever expose him. But now, the one person he had spent decades trying to keep away from the truth was sitting across from me. My mother. And for the first time in 30 years, she was ready to come home. This time, she wasn't running. She was ready to tell the truth. By the time my mother and I returned to Cedar Creek, I understood that the truth wasn't going to remain buried any longer. We took the evidence to the authorities, and the investigation that followed finally connected the pieces that had been missing for 30 years. The financial records my mother had preserved matched the documents recovered from my father's hidden room, and the recordings provided information investigators had never had before. Arthur Whitmore was eventually confronted with evidence of the fraud, the intimidation, and the deliberate manipulation of the company records. The man everyone had spent decades respecting was finally forced to answer for the things he had done. Arthur was eventually convicted for the financial crimes connected to Bennett Industrial Supply and for his role in intimidating witnesses and concealing evidence. The investigation also revealed that several people had helped him over the years,
although some had died before they could ever be questioned. Arthur had spent decades believing that time had erased the evidence against him, but he had made one mistake. He had underestimated my mother. She had kept every document, every recording, every photograph, and every piece of evidence because somewhere inside her, she had always believed that one day the truth would matter.
My father never got to see that day. That was the part that hurt the most. I spent years believing Thomas had betrayed my mother and allowed her to disappear because he didn't care enough to stop her. Instead, I discovered that he had made an impossible decision because he believed protecting me required him to carry a terrible secret. I don't excuse every choice he made, because hiding the truth from me for 30 years caused wounds that never needed to exist. But after learning everything, I finally understood that my father had been trying to protect his little girl in the only way he thought he could. My mother and I didn't magically become the family we might have been if she had never disappeared. 30 years is too long for something like that to simply disappear. There were questions I needed answered, memories I needed to recover, and anger that I had every right to feel. There were moments when I wanted to blame her for leaving, even after knowing why she had gone. But she never asked me to forget those years. Instead, she listened. She allowed me to be angry, allowed me to grieve, and slowly gave me the opportunity to know her again. The strangest part was realizing how much of my mother I had unknowingly carried with me. I discovered that my love of painting came from her. My habit of keeping handwritten notes came from her. Even the way I laughed when I was embarrassed was apparently something I had inherited from her. For 30 years, I thought I had lost everything she had given me, only to discover that pieces of her had been with me the entire time. She hadn't been present to watch me grow, but somehow her influence had survived. Eleanor eventually apologized for remaining silent. I didn't forgive her immediately, and I told her that I needed time before I could decide what our relationship would become. She accepted that without arguing. She had spent decades carrying her own guilt, and although she had been afraid of Arthur, fear didn't erase the fact that her silence had contributed to my suffering. Some betrayals aren't committed through actions. Sometimes they happen through silence, through knowing the truth and deciding that someone else is better off not knowing. I also learned that my father had written one final letter to me shortly before his death. He had apparently planned to give it to me when he knew he didn't have much time left, but his health deteriorated before he could do it. The letter explained that he had always regretted allowing me to believe my mother had abandoned me. He wrote that he hoped I would eventually understand that his greatest mistake had come from trying too hard to protect me. Reading those words didn't erase my anger, but it gave me something I hadn't expected after his death, an opportunity to say goodbye to him properly. My childhood had been built around a story that wasn't true. I had spent years thinking my mother had chosen another life over me, when in reality, she had spent decades carrying the pain of being separated from her daughter. My father had allowed that misunderstanding to continue because he was terrified of what might happen if the truth came out. Arthur had spent years building a respectable life, while the people he had harmed carried the consequences of his actions. And somehow, after all those years, one hidden room had brought the entire truth back into the light. Today, my mother and I are building a relationship, one memory at a time. We visit each other regularly, and sometimes we simply sit together without talking. There is still sadness between us, but there is also something I never thought I would have again, a mother to call when something wonderful happens. I know we can never recover the years we lost, but I've stopped asking myself what our lives might have looked like if everything had been different. We can't rewrite the past.
We can only decide what we do with the truth once we finally have it. And that is what I want to leave you with today. Sometimes the people we believe have abandoned us may be carrying secrets we know nothing about. Sometimes the person who appears to be protecting you may be hiding something because they are afraid of what the truth will cost. And sometimes a family can spend decades living inside a lie simply because nobody has the courage to open the locked door. My story taught me that the truth can hurt terribly when it finally arrives, but living forever without knowing the truth can hurt even more. So let me ask you something before you go. If you discovered that your parent had lied to you for 30 years about why the other parent disappeared, but you eventually learned that the lie was meant to protect you from a dangerous person, would you forgive them? Would you want to know the truth, even if discovering it completely changed the way you remembered your childhood? Or do you believe some secrets are better left buried if they were created out of love? I genuinely want to hear what you think, so tell me your answer in the comments. Thank you for staying with me through this story. If it touched you, made you question the meaning of trust, or reminded you that there can be more to someone's story than what we are told, please like this video. Subscribe to Echoes of Trust and Betrayal. Share it with someone who enjoys emotional stories filled with secrets, family mysteries, and unexpected revelations. And leave your thoughts in the comments. And as always, tell me where in the world you're listening from. This is Echoes of Trust and Betrayal, where every story reminds us that sometimes the truth doesn't disappear. It simply waits for someone brave enough to open the door.